All right, hello everybody. I wish I could be there in person. I was able to come to to Roswell the other day or a couple weeks ago when I was coming back from the Grand Canyon with my family. So it didn't make sense for me to come down today, but I'm happy to get a chance to talk to you. I'm going to talk to you about these things called the Nazca Mummies, and I know that most of you don't know who I am, so let me just very briefly introduce myself. I teach philosophy here at the Ohio State University, and mostly I work in things like the philosophy of religion and ethics, but lately I've picked up an interest in UFOs and aliens, and in particular these Nazca mummies. Up until a few weeks ago, I was one of the people who was out there kind of defending that these were the remains of alien organisms. And for various reasons, which will become clear today, I have recently changed my mind, which clearly shows to the people on the internet that I am a deep state mole. Working for some kind of a three-letter agency. This image was created within 2 hours of the podcast interview that I did last weekend on the Good Trouble Show. So anyways, I'm going to start with a little bit of a disclaimer here, which is also kind of going to serve as stage setting for kind of my relationship to the project that I'll be talking about today. So while I'm not a credentialed scientist myself, I am working closely with a team of professionals, all on a volunteer basis, exploring this for fun out of a curious pursuit of the truth. So I have five specific people that I'm working with pretty closely. One specialist in medical imaging, another in reconstructive surgery, one in bioinformatics, which is kind of DNA data analysis, proteomics, which is protein analysis, and paleontology. One member of our team, Anonymous Dave, this person's name is not Dave. We just call this person Anonymous Dave when we want that person to be anonymous, has been to Peru and worked with the Inkari Institute to obtain samples for analysis. This person is a working PhD scientist in proteomics with access to state-of-the-art equipment. He has the approval of and some modest funding from his supervisors for the project. I'll just talk a little tiny bit about some things that Anonymous Dave has shown the team, which has led to some of the things that we'll talk about today. In addition, I've been able to closely review CT scan information with other qualified professionals in related fields, in particular anthropology, gynecological surgery, and veterinary medicine. All of us within the core team began working together because we believed that these were the desiccated corpses of aliens, as they seem to be, and we wanted to prove that. One by one, over the course of months, based on close attention to the data, all of our views have changed. The emerging consensus and current working hypothesis of our team is that some of the Nazca mummies, the small ones, are ancient constructed archaeological objects. It is my intent in this presentation to explain why this hypothesis is important, why our views have changed, and to offer a public retraction of some of the things I've said in previous presentations that I now believe to be in error. Okay, that's kind of the formally written part, and the rest of it I'll just kind of chat through. So I know that not everybody knows what the Nazca mummies are. Let me begin with just a little introduction to what these things are. So they are a perplexing collection of bodies brought by huaqueros, which is kind of the Spanish word for something like a grave robber or a tomb raider, people who look for archaeological artifacts to sell them. They brought them to this archaeologist, Thierry Jamin, for identification in 2016. The alleged discovery site has never been revealed, and this is part of the puzzle of this case, and one of the things that all of us wish wasn't the case. But there is supposed to be a discovery site, an underground chamber containing perhaps a stone sarcophagus and various other kinds of things. All these claims have been made. There are some photographs out there which allege to be from this site, but nobody on my team and no one that I've spoken to knows where the site actually is. There are at least 60 beings that appear to be mummified bodies of different shapes, sizes, detail, and apparent biological coherence. That'll make more sense here in a minute when I show you some of these detailed things. They are presumed to be hoaxes by most of the world. If you look around at any media coverage in mainstream outlets about this thing, there's just kind of a mockery that these things aren't worth paying attention to. But there is a determined band of defenders who believe that they are worthy of much more investigation, and I still consider myself among that band of defenders, even though the details of my view have changed. So there are four main types of bodies that I want to discuss briefly. These are the ones that I have the most access of information to. There's the ones that I call M types. These are based on this specimen called Maria. Maria, I'll talk a little bit more in a little while, but basically a full-sized human body with these unusual hands and feet, also an elongated skull and a couple of other features. There's what I call J types. These are based on this being called Josephina, a little thing. I'll show you to scale here in a moment. Suye, even littler than that, very small, about this size, containing some little wing buds on the back and these kind of very dense material within its skull. And then there are some loose hands. They're very large, so substantially larger than a human hand, many more bones in the fingers and such than in a human hand. So these are the ones that my team has primarily been working with in one way or another. We have CT scan information on the M, J, and S types. We have X-rays on all of them. We have DNA on H types, J types, and M types. We do not have DNA on S types yet. We also have proteology, protein analysis on some of these, at least H, J, and M. I don't think we have anything on the S types yet. That information is currently in process, so I can't report on all of it, but we'll talk about a little bit more of some stuff here today. There's also, as I said, a bunch of other types. So this specimen in particular has gotten a lot of attention because Flavio Estrada Moreno, who works for the Ministry of Culture in one way or another in Peru, has been debunking these objects, the ones I'll be talking about today. And one of the ways he's done that is by pointing at this being, the one that's on the screen right now. Now, one of the reasons I got involved in this as a philosophy professor is because I've been concerned about the argumentation that's being offered against these beings. And it had been my impression, still is my impression, that most of the critiques have missed the mark in many ways. So obviously, if this thing, which does very clearly seem to be a construct, is a construct, that doesn't imply that different things, which look substantially different than it, are also a construct. That was one of the things that I called attention to in my first video on this topic. But you can see that there are these bones which are not at all connected to each other. They're very cleanly cut in a sharp right angle cut. If you zoom in on its hands, there's not actually fingers here. It's just kind of a piece of leather that little grooves have been cut into. This is another specimen, just to give you a couple of ideas. It's a very similar looking head to a J-type, but the body is substantially different. You can see the bones are just kind of floating around in the body here. Here's another one, very different and small. Lots and lots and lots of ribs, lots and lots and lots of bones in the arm. If you look closely, you can see that the vertebrae are not even connected to each other, not even adjacent to each other. They're just kind of floating in the back of the body. So I don't know. Oh, yes. So these beings here are the ones that I'll just call other for the time being. Now, one of the reasons I think my presentation here, the view that I'm presenting today, is important is because up until now, everyone has been treating objects like these as utterly worthless, perhaps to be destroyed, certainly to be ignored because they're fakes. But one of the upshots of what I'll be proposing is that if the main beings that we're considering are archaeological objects, then there's a decent chance that these should be considered archaeologics too, at least until proven otherwise. So even some of these beings that seem to be lower quality or very clearly put together out of the bones of other things, they might still be very important archaeological artifacts. And so we would need to kind of look into the details of each one of them before we dismiss them. And I don't want to suggest that there's nothing puzzling in this cache of bodies and skulls and bones and things that have been found, because here's an interesting case that I will not talk about at all. Some of you will be familiar with the skull on the far left. This is called the Star Child skull. It was found in Mexico in 1999. It was debunked pretty early on. The person who found it thought it might be an alien-human hybrid skull. It was debunked pretty early on as a kind of rare deformity. And I don't know what to make of this, but there are two more of these skulls that were found in Peru. So that needs to be reconsidered also. Maybe there's some evidence that there are beings with skulls of this type, and we have just the skulls of them. I don't know exactly what's going on here, but I just want to indicate that there are a lot of remaining mysteries. The stuff that I'm talking about today, I think, will be helpful in moving us forward, but it doesn't, in fact, settle the puzzles of what's going on or what has gone on historically in Peru. So this is the main claim that I'm going to be making. When people look at these things, there's been this debate going on. Is it an alien, as it seems to be, these elongated skulled tridactyl things that look like coherent bodies? Are they coherent bodies of aliens, or are they a hoax? And what I want to suggest is that this is called a false dichotomy. So sometimes people say it has to be this or it has to be that. But actually, there are a whole range of options. And I want to explore a little bit of what those options are and then talk about one that's different from these two for the rest of the time here. So here are some explanatory options. Either these things are natural or they are constructs. All I mean by this is natural, whatever it is to emerge from nature in an ordinary evolutionary kind of a way, or a construct, something built intentionally, using technology or something like that. Among the natural beings, there could be terrestrial ones, those ones from Earth, or they might be from somewhere else. When I use the term alien, I use it very broadly. I don't mean it to mean extraterrestrial necessarily, although in this case it kind of looks that way. So anyways, among the constructs, you could think about the modern, something that was built recently, or something that was built a while ago, old ones. I do want to note that in the old construct theory, there is a couple of alternatives here. You might literally have a living construct. So some people talk about in the UFO world that maybe some of these beings, like the small grays, are something like artificially intelligent biological beings, like replicants or something like that. That's a possibility we could at least consider. And then, of course, there's just old, perhaps ancient, inanimate objects. So my old hypothesis is that they were, in fact, the remains of aliens. I did kind of transition through this idea that maybe they were some kind of living biobots. But I've kind of settled into the inanimate old construct view, which is what I'll be talking about here today. Just a little annoying philosophical note. So this whole thing, this structure is built up of what are called mutually exclusive and collectively exhaustive dichotomies. So I just define construct as not natural, alien as not terrestrial, modern as not, old as not modern, and inanimate as not living. And that means that this covers all of the bases. So this should be an exhaustive list of possibilities. I'm going to just talk about three of them here today: the alien hypothesis, the hoax hypothesis, and the archaeological hypothesis. Some people have talked about the possibility that these are like crypto-terrestrials. I'm not going to take that seriously for reasons you'll see here today. And I don't see any particular reason to think that when they were constructed, which I believe to have happened more than 1,000 years ago, that they were alive, a biobot, or anything like that. But, we're still doing research. Maybe we'll discover something along the way that changes my mind. I mean, I've already changed my mind pretty substantially from the alien hypothesis to the archaeological hypothesis. It's funny. The reason I got called a mole on Reddit is because I changed my mind, and I think that's kind of hilarious because everybody involved in this case, seriously involved in this case, has been asking for more research, more data, more scientists to get involved, and so it shouldn't be surprising that some new hypotheses are on the table now that we have some new tools like proteomics, and we have some new observations available to the members of our team. I do want to say one more thing here before we leave this behind and get into some of the details, which is there is an option, of course, that some or all of the above are true. That is, we shouldn't assume, because there are so many different types of beings here and so many individual specimens of each type, we could have a mixture. There could still be, for instance, remains of some kind of an alien body mixed in with these other things, even if some of them turn out to be hoaxes, which some of them, it does seem, are hoaxes. That is, some of them have been created in recent times, probably to make money. But I'm going to suggest that the core specimens of the J types and the S types, at least, are archaeological constructs. Regardless of what they ultimately turn out to be, they are worthy of much more investigation. There's been this attitude about people who hear about these things, oh, don't worry about them, they're a hoax, just ignore them. And I want to suggest of these three possibilities I talked about, under every single version, under every of the live hypotheses, these things must be taken seriously. Under the alien hypothesis, this would be an incredible opportunity to learn about the biology of beings from somewhere else. Under the archaeological hypothesis, this would be a shocking, absolutely shocking historical discovery of the highest importance. And if it is a hoax, then it's a moral atrocity that should be studied, explained, and stopped as soon as possible. Because if it's a hoax, it does involve the desecration of human remains. And so we cannot just say, well, it's a hoax, ignore it. If it's a hoax, we still need to study it. So this has kind of been the mantra of my team for months now, right? It doesn't matter what the truth is. We need to get to the bottom of this. This is important no matter what it turns out to be. So I just want to say very clearly to some of the people who have suggested that these things be ignored, under no circumstances should any of these objects be destroyed or hidden from researchers, at least not until a lot of work is done to make sure that these are not genuine, either genuine bodies of something that was once alive or constructs, because even the constructs are made out of things that were once alive, and the constructs might have deep historical value. So we need to make sure that we're really studying these things no matter what the truth turns out to be. So these are the four that I have the most information on. I'm going to talk to you about both the J's and the M's, but I'm going to spend most of the time talking about the J's. The J types are the ones that were presented to Congress in Mexico last fall. They're the ones that I've always been the most interested in, because if they did turn out to be the remains of coherent biological organisms, then it has always been my view that they would be very likely from someplace else, extraterrestrial, extra dimensional. I don't believe in time travel. There could be timeline dumping. I don't know. We're not going to talk about time travel today, but time travel is a puzzling hypothesis. All right. So J-types are named after Josefina. She was the first one to be identified and closely studied. That's all J means. J means like Josefina. So what is a J-type like? They have tridactyl hands and feet. They have an elongated skull with two large eyes. They have single bones in the forearm and lower legs. So humans and other primates and almost all of the bony creatures here have two bones in the forearm and two bones in the lower legs. Not so with the J-types. There's only one in each arm and each leg. There are no ball and socket hips. This is one of the things that led me to say originally that if these things were the dried remains of some kind of living organism, then it wouldn't be from around here, because all of the bony creatures on this planet have ball and socket hips. They have unusually hollow bones. Some people have suggested that the bones are kind of bird-like or sometimes dinosaur or reptile-like. They have circular ribs, so they do not have a sternum. The rib just begins at the back and goes all the way around. There's no split in the middle like there are on most of the things around here. And they do have reptilian skin. So that's kind of the profile of what makes something a J-type. Now, as I said, what I want to suggest is that these are archaeological artifacts. They were constructed by, in my belief, the Nazca people about 1,000 to 1,500, 1,700 years ago, and that they have survived into the present as a fascinating piece of evidence about the life and practices of the Nazca. Why do I believe that now? I'm going to give you four reasons. One is that there is in my view, conclusive evidence that the Llama Skull hypothesis is correct. This has been in the air for a long time. The idea that the skulls of the J-types have a similarity to certain parts of llama skulls has been known for many years. But I took it especially seriously after my proteomics person gave us some information identifying that in the skulls of the J-types, there were, I believe it was 18 llama-specific proteins that were found. So when that discovery was made, when that data came to my awareness, I spent a lot more time digging into the llama skull hypothesis. I tracked down a CT scan of a llama skull and I started hacking away at it to try to figure out if I could turn a llama skull into a J-type skull. I did this, I just want to remind everybody, I did this because I believed that it would not be possible to convert a llama skull into a J-type skull. And then it became quite apparent to me that it did. I'll show you a little 3D animation here in a moment, which will hopefully help you understand why I came to that conclusion. There are natural fiber and glue plugs at the joints. Now, we only have one joint that we have been able to closely study. It's a toe joint in one of the J-types, but I'll show you that information here in a bit. And the analysis that's been done by Anonymous Dave indicates that there are no polymers. And, polymers show up really clearly in the kind of analysis that he's been doing. And polymers are present in basically all adhesives and resins and coatings and things like that that are produced in the modern world. So this is an indication that these glues and fibers might in fact be ancient. There are apparently ancient modifications. That is, there are modifications to the bodies in order to construct them that would be surprising if they were done in modern times, but not surprising if they were done 1,000 years ago or more. I'll explain all these in detail in just a moment. And there's reptile skin, but it's not all reptile skin. There's also a kind of resin coating certain parts of the body. And this solves one of the puzzles that I mentioned in my first video on this topic. How could you make such a thing if you had a seamless coat of skin over the whole thing? So there's reasons to believe that there is not a seamless coat of skin over the whole thing. All right, let's just talk about llama skull replacement theory here for a moment. I'm going to show you a little video that I created. So this is a 3D render made out of the CT scan information from a llama skull. Nobody thinks it is a llama skull. It is only a portion of the llama skull. It is the back part, the brain case of the llama skull. All I'm doing in this animation is removing material. There's nothing that's being added here. So if we take that part of the skull out, and we isolate it so that we can see it more closely, it has a number of interesting features which we're going to compare to the J-type skulls here in a moment. Look at those two open panels in the back and that rough area in particular. So this is Josefina, and you can see that the little thing sticking out of the bottom, the rough area on the back of her skull, where the ear holes are, where the eye sockets are, where the mouth hole is, all line up. These are the super dense bones that are inside of the llama's ear. They are located in exactly the same place, exactly the same shape as they are inside of Josefina. We're going to look into the back of her head. Some people have talked about the eye sockets, but this is a relatively small modification to the llama skull to expand that naturally occurring hole to make it look like the eye sockets. This is just pulling out all of the low density stuff. So you can see how the density stuff lines up exactly in both cases. You can also see how the mouth hole is still there. There's just been a couple of bone plates added. There's also been a couple of bone plates added to the back to fill in those two holes that I mentioned a moment ago. So a J-type skull is just a llama skull with two panels added to the back right here. And we'll pan across so that you can see the other one, held in place by this some kind of a natural adhesive mixture. And then the same thing has been done on the front where the mouth plates are. You can kind of see that there. So this, in my view, has been enough to convince me that I no longer need to take the skulls of J-types to be the actual skulls of a living thing. They were constructed. Now, it is still possible in principle that the head has been replaced. This is not crazy. As we'll see later, the Nazca did do things with the heads of people in and around them. So it's possible that when the J-types died, whatever they were, as part of a burial ritual, their head was removed and replaced with a replica head. There's actually a very famous story in the history of philosophy about a philosopher named Jeremy Bentham, who was one of the first utilitarians. And when he died, he donated his money to a university under the condition that they mummify his body and remove his head and replace it with a wax head that would continue to look like him even as his real head decayed. So there is historical precedent for something like replacing a head with a replicated head for burial purposes. But the Llama Skull hypothesis alone doesn't show that the whole body is a construct, but I am inclined to think, at least of the J-types, that their whole bodies are constructed. Let me show you why I think that. So in between the bones, there seems to be a natural fiber and glue plugs. As I say, the only one we have direct information on is this bone right here. This is a toe bone from one of the J-types. You can see that it is hollow, which would explain why it looks a little thinner. It's unclear exactly how it was hollowed, but if you imagine taking a bone and scraping the marrow out of it somehow, then it would be a little bit thinner. We don't know exactly how this was done, but this is kind of our, as I say, our working hypothesis. Because there are these fibers that appear to be naturally occurring fibers that have been shoved into the ends of these bones. And then this glue, which looks a lot like hide glue, which you get by boiling animal hides to get out the collagens and stuff. And then, you make a glue out of that. So the basic idea is you take two bones, you shove this stuff in the end of them, and you kind of wrap that with this, soak that with this glue, let that dry, and there you go. So this is one bone. How am I getting from that bone to the whole body? Well, you can actually see, if you look at the X-rays, you can see that there is something in between the bones. So some of the people who've been debunking these things have pointed out for a long time the strangeness of the bones, the asymmetry of the bones, how some of the bones look like they might be in backwards. I just want to draw your attention to the elbows and knees. There's a couple things you can note here. One is that the bone is kind of jagged on each end, but you can actually see that there is something in there, right? These kind of gel-looking, orb-looking kind of shapes that are in there. So hypothesis, this is what those glue plugs look like on an X-ray. More data, of course, required to substantiate everything I'm saying today, but these are the kinds of reasons why we're taking this as our working hypothesis. There are some modifications which appear to be ancient. In particular, on the bottom of J-type skulls, there is a hole. That hole is not circular, it is rectangular. As you can see on the left, this is a J-type skull. On the right, of course, is just a 3D print of the J-type skull made by my friend Elena. Hi, Elena. That you can see is not a very big hole. So it's bigger on the one on the left than it is on the one on the right, which all by itself is concerning for any kind of actual biological coherence argument, because if there are holes which are of different sizes in different skulls, that would be very surprising. But they're asymmetrical, they're not circular, they're kind of strange. Why is this evidence for ancient rather than modern? Well, because if you wanted to make a hole approximately that big in the bottom of a skull, it seems like the tooling you would use would be unlikely to produce a shape like this. I'm going to refer you to Project Prototype's video about animal skull carving. It's quite nice. I'll just show you a couple of screenshots here. Right, so you can put a pretty good sized drill bit into the bottom of a skull like this without it having any problems. So if you wanted to make a hole big enough to stick, kind of a thumb-sized thing through it, you could probably just drill a hole. If you weren't going to drill a hole, you'd probably just use a Dremel tool. And, if you use the Dremel tool, you can create these very elaborate kinds of shapes. But if what you're doing is trying to make a hole in which to shove a spinal column, which is what this seems to be, then it would be strange to make it rectangular, unless you kind of couldn't really make a hole that big with the tools that you had. So hypothesis, it's surprising that we see a hole like this if it's modern, because you could either use a drill bit or a Dremel. And since what you'd want is a circular hole, it would be really easy to make a circular hole. Not so if you're the Nazca. Can they make circular holes? Yes, but only pretty small ones. They're hand drilling, so they have small drill bits that they actually used to make to do brain surgery with. So on the right, you can see a series of small holes that have been cut kind of irregularly, and then I think they probably hit it to get that thing to crack so they could remove that panel and do whatever they were doing in the brains. On the left-hand side, you can actually see another skull from this time period that's been patched by a piece of metal. But I specifically wanted to show you this skull, which has this kind of rough rectangular shape cut into it, similar to the kind of cut that we see on the J-type skull. So the claim here is that if you were drilling a hole or cutting a hole, making a hole in the bottom of a llama skull to use it for creating a J-type, it would be strange for it to be that shape if it were done in modern times, but not strange if it were done in ancient times. Another thing that would be strange if it were done in modern times is the shape on the ends of these bones. Notice how, remember, they're open, they are hollow, which is presumably, if we're thinking about construction, because you have to put the fiber in there to get it to hold together. But you can see how it's not a clean cut. It looks like this would be the kind of thing you would get if you didn't have really good cutting tools, or you didn't need really good cutting tools. This isn't even going to be an exposed area. So you might just hit the end of it with a stone or something like that, which would produce an opening fit for putting these natural fibers into, but not a clean cut. Whereas something like this is what you would expect if it were done in the modern world, because a bandsaw is the best job to do this. You just grab a bone and just run it right through there, and it would only take a few moments, but you wouldn't get this jagged kind of thing that we see in the J-types. There's one more thing I want to talk about here, which is the reptile skin. Everybody who's been defending these has been talking about a continuous coating of reptile skin, or a continuous sheet of reptile skin. This is why they're saying that. You can see on the left, on the stomach area, the belly area, very clear patterns of reptile skin. On the right, you can see the back. That one on the right is named Victoria, and some skin samples were taken from Victoria, and then they were stained and studied, and sure enough, it looks just like reptile skin. So how do you make a being that is covered in reptile skin and wrap it around all the fingers and all that kind of stuff? This was one of the reasons why I originally believed that these must be genuine living remains, or genuine remains of living organisms. Well, you can see that there's a transition on the bottom part of this image from what is obviously a sheet of reptile leather to this kind of textured thing. And there were some warning signs for me early on when I was talking to some of the people who've seen these bodies. They were talking about a resin covering the skin, a hard resin, which made it difficult to study the skin. So you can see this. This is actually Josefina, not today, but relatively recently. The diatomaceous earth that was covering her body has been cleaned off. And you can see up close, if you look at her face, there's this kind of texturing on it that is consistent with there being a resin of some kind. We're not totally sure what the resin is. We have some samples, and some initial analysis seems to indicate that it might be a mixture of clay and hair and animal skin that's been boiled together in some kind of a way, which when dried would look like this. We do also have a video of someone taking a sampling off of one of these large hands. It is incredibly hard stuff. The person I spoke to who did this sample gathering actually broke a scalpel trying to cut through it and had to use a Dremel to cut in to get anything off of this so that they could do some analysis. So what I want to do is just kind of walk through step by step how you build a JType. Now, I'm not pretending that I've solved or that my team has solved all of the problems involved in explaining how these things were made. But this is kind of a rough sketch of what it seems needs to be done. We're speculating here, of course, and more data needs to be gathered. We'll talk about that at the end. But this is kind of a blueprint for how one might build a JType. You're going to start out with something like a monkey. So the thing that is going to be the hardest to explain and the thing that kept me stymied for the longest time is the torso itself. Because if you look at the CT scan information of the inside of the torso, it looks really coherent. Everything looks connected up in the right kind of ways, especially this spinal column integrates with the back and the shoulders and all that kind of stuff. So you're probably going to need to start with a torso of the right size and keep that mostly intact. So one working hypothesis is a monkey. There are at least 3 species of monkeys in Peru that are approximately big enough. This is a spider monkey, a howler monkey, and a woolly monkey. So say that you pick whichever of these or whatever else it might be, and you use that as your baseline. Then you cut and fuse the ribs and I said sternum, but it's not supposed to say sternum. It's supposed to say collarbones, clavicles, using the glue plug technique. So you can see here that there are these bones which are supposed to be completely circular ribs. It's hard to see in any single scan, and I didn't make an animation of this, but if you look here, it does look like there might be a place where you could join. So you'd cut off the ribs on both sides, and then you'd build a bridge between them. And then you'd put that glue and fiber thing here. You could do the same thing with the clavicles. You could cut on each end and then join it here in the middle. All of this, by the way, I do not pretend would be easy. This would be incredibly labor intensive, especially if this were done in the ancient world with ancient tools. You're going to have to reshape the pelvis. The pelvis on a JType is very strange. We're not sure what the pelvis is, but it looks like it might just be the top part of the pelvis, so the kind of winged parts of the hip of whatever being this is. Given the kind of verticality of this, there's reasons to think that it might be something that walks basically upright, which is why we're thinking likely primate. But again, more data needs to be gathered here. And we can talk about what kind of data would be useful here in a bit. Then you're going to join and attach the limbs using the glue plugs. We've already talked about the kind of knees and elbows. What about the hips? Remember, there is no ball joint hip, so how do you attach the leg to the hip? It looks like, again, hypothesis. Everything here is a hypothesis that needs to be tested. But you can see on the top part of that bone, that kind of gel bubble looking thing. That could very well be a chunk of this glue embedded in this fiber holding it in place. You are going to have to add reptile skin panels. There are large reptiles in Peru. This is a tegu. I'm not saying it is a tegu. We would have to look, but this is a hypothesis we could test. You get a large panel of skin, you put it on the belly, you put it on the back, you cover the big areas with that, and then you fill all the small parts with the resin mixture. So, I puzzled for a long time how these might not be real, because how would you get skin to wrap around all the fingers and toes without a seam? Well, here's the toes, and it looks like it is, in fact, this kind of resiny mixture. Now, remember, the resin mixture, as far as we can tell, is made from some amount of clay, but also hair and skin. So it's not surprising that it looks like skin. It's not surprising that it behaves like skin under a CT scan, because it is skin. It's just not a continuous sheet of skin. It's skin that's been made into this resin and then spread over the body. And then you're going to have to wrap up the whole thing and bury it in diatomaceous earth. One thing I'll make some noise about here in a few minutes is that everything I just talked about, especially all the manipulation of the ribs and the collarbones, would require that those bones not be brittle, but that they be relatively flexible so that you could move them around without them just snapping. So this would have had to be done relatively soon after the death of the primary organism. If we're assuming that it's a monkey here, you'd have to have a monkey, and then relatively soon after it dies, you would have to do this to it. Then you could bury it under diatomaceous earth. This is, of course, where people suggest these have been found. This is a photograph, allegedly, of the site in which they were found. This is why they all look white. They're not covered in plaster. They're covered in diatomaceous earth, which is made up of the remains of little diatoms. It's a super desiccant substance which will pull all the liquids out and suck them up nicely. So if you have this body made up of other body parts, you kind of wrap it in something and you glue it all together as described and you stick it in there. What's going to happen is as all that flesh rots, all that gooey rottiness is going to soak into all of these joints that we talked about, all of the resin and stuff. And then as it dries, it's just going to become one big continuous object. This is why, again, it is not surprising that even very smart, very skilled people who have looked at these things under X-rays, in CT scans, etc., have been puzzled about what they are. I want to just speak to that very briefly. Very highly qualified people from a whole variety of fields in Latin America, and in my experience in the United States, when you sit down and show these things to them, the CT scan to these, everyone is baffled. They look like living things. And the hypothesis that I'm pushing forward here is that they look like living things because they are made up of basically exactly the same components that the actual bodies, living bodies, are made of. And then as they rot, they cohere and then dry out. Could you do this in the modern world? Well, maybe. It kind of depends on the details. So what I'm going to suggest here is that it's difficult to explain these things as modern constructs that have been made, say, in the last 10 years or so, to be sold for money because they look like aliens. So why do I think that? Why do I think maybe these wouldn't be able to be made now? So you'd need a careful choice of materials and methods. You could, in principle, do this. Like you could think, maybe we're going to make these fake aliens and people are going to want to put them through CT scanners and X-rays and all that kind of stuff. So we're going to make sure that we don't use any polymers, and we're not going to put in any wires or anything like, staples or bolts or brackets or anything like that, because that'll all show up on the CT scans and the X-rays. So we're not going to do that. But that still wouldn't explain why you would cut this like weird shaped hole in the bottom of the skull. It wouldn't explain why you have these jagged cuts at the elbows and knees and all that. Unless you think that person also thought ahead and thought, well, if they do figure out that it's not an alien, maybe we can convince them that it's an ancient artifact. So anyways, this is kind of weird because this would kind of imply the intent of the hoaxers is to pass them off both as aliens with maybe artifacts as a backup plan. This is, in my view, kind of implausible. It also has to fool the radiocarbon dating that's been done. There has been radiocarbon dating done, and it does date at 1,000 to 1,700, 2,000 years old. So people have suggested that maybe they started with mummies and or other ancient remains, like maybe you took a mummy and then made a mummy into this thing, like a human mummy or a monkey mummy or a llama mummy or something. But this is extremely difficult because mummies are very brittle. That picture of the bone that I've shown you where we have the glue plug is broken because Anonymous Dave was trying to get samples out of it and it just cracked. Like he said that they would just crack even if you just tried to hold them with tweezers. They're incredibly brittle. So the idea that you could fake the radiocarbon information by starting with mummies seems implausible. If then you have to use relatively fresh bodies, like I suggested a moment ago, when you start out with something newly dead, then you're going to have to get a pretty decent sized cache of monkeys. There are at least 25 full bodies of JTypes, and approximately another 20 or 30 loose skulls. There could be more than that, but we know of at least that many. So you'd need at least 25 or so monkeys to work with. The other candidate, which is, of course, much more disturbing, and one of the reasons why it's extremely important that we get more information on these very soon, is because a decent candidate for a J-type bone structure is a human infant. The shoulder blades look kind of like humans. There's aspects of the hip that perhaps, if modified, look like humans. There is a possibility that the torsos of J-types are largely built out of human remains, little human remains. It would have to be an infant. And you would need a bunch of them. You can't just there's not just a few of these things, there's a whole pipeline. So there's at least 60 plus specimens that you'd have to explain with a modern hoax hypothesis. All right, that's all I'm going to say about the J-types. I'm going to blast very quickly through the M-types. You'll see why here in just a moment. So an M-type has almost normal human anatomy. All of the bones and internal organs and all of those things are intact. These are the ones when people say they aren't technically mummies, they're desiccated corpses. That's when they're especially talking about the M-types because all of the body parts are there intact. What is different about them from normal humans then? They do have these elongated skulls. They have various distinctive facial features, kind of large eye socket looking things. They do not have external ears. Their noses, and sometimes it looks like perhaps their mouths, are different in various ways. They do have tridactyl hands and feet, so 3 fingers on each hand, 3 toes on each foot, and they're long and strange. They also apparently have strange fingerprints. There's a claim that some of them have fingerprints that run side to side in straight lines, unlike the swirls that are on normal humans. This is why they've been suggested to be perhaps alien in some way. Given their almost total similarity to humans, we assume that these are modified humans. Let me just clarify what I mean by that, because we're still leaving open a lot of really weird options that need to be investigated. So if we think about it as a modified human, you could imagine modification happening in any number of ways. So one would be genetic changes, and you could just do that naturally. So for instance, this might be some branch primate, like the Denisovans or the Neanderthal, or like maybe there was just a hominid species that had 3 fingers and 3 toes and an elongated head. That is possible, something worth looking into. It's possible that this happened through selective breeding or hybridization, right? In the UFO world, there's all of these stories about people suggesting that when they're abducted, then they're bred with these beings from somewhere else, and then there are hybrid children walking around. Actual genetic hybridization requires very close related genetic similarity. So really, if you were going to genetically cross a human with something non-human, you wouldn't do that through ordinary sexual intercourse, for instance. You would have to do some kind of genetic engineering. And of course, if you're doing genetic engineering, you might not need to have any sexual intercourse involved at all. All of those things are out open right now. Like these things might be genetically engineered, they might be hybrids, they might be some kind of naturally occurring thing. A lot more work needs to be done to figure out what's going on with the M-types. Or there could be physical changes. So you could physically start with a human body and change it in various ways. You could do this perhaps during the lifetime. For instance, we know that skulls are elongated over the course of lifetimes in many cultures by binding the skull when it is young before it is solidified in infancy. You could do surgery in principle on the hand. I'll show you how to do that in just a moment, although it would probably make the hands essentially useless. You could do it after they died a long time ago, or you could do it after they died now. So I'm going to go with the I'm going to kind of go with the post-mortem alteration ancient hypothesis. That's the one I'm personally leaning towards. But there's really not enough reliable data at this point to distinguish between these alternative explanations. So I'm not going to be able to give you much help here. I've talked to many people who are studying these bodies, including the McDowells, and who have a team of forensic scientists from the United States have recently been down there. I spoke to a member of their team yesterday. We are all puzzled about the M-types. This should be left open. We do not know what these things are. But let's run with my kind of living hypothesis for the time being that there are physically modified and they were physically modified a long time ago. Can that theory work out? I think so. Whoops, I don't know why that did that again. That's wrong slide. Okay, possibly ancient physical changes. So, as I suggested, we have lots of skulls from the Paracas people and other around the world that you could elongate the skull. So, elongating skulls, in principle, is not that difficult. Now, there are open questions about whether the elongation of the skulls on the M types is the same as this. I've talked to Dr. Hernandez at the University of Ica a week or so ago, and his suggestion is that there are kind of telltale marks of skull binding that are not present in the M types. So it's not obvious that skull binding is the explanation, but that's an available explanation that it should at least be investigated. What about these fingers? Especially, this is Maria. Maria has five phalanges, which are the bones that you have in your fingers. So what I want to do is walk through with you how you would take a normal human hand and, in principle, turn it into an M-type hand. Now, the first thing you would have to do is just remove the thumb and the pinky entirely. Now, some of the bodies, well, and then you have to cut through the flesh that creates the palm to free up that metacarpal so that it looks like a phalange. So you could do that. Again, that would render the hand essentially useless. So if you did this during the lifetime, this being would not really be able to use their hand. Now, if they're royalty and they have a bunch of servants or something like that, then that might not be the end of the world. But it obviously would be a very costly thing to do during the lifetime. But Maria has an extra bone. So in order to build Maria, you would have to do this. You'd have to cut off the distal phalange of Maria and then the intermediate and distal phalanges from some other being and attach them somehow. Now, if that were done during the lifetime, that would be an incredibly weird and amazing kind of surgery. It could also, of course, be done post-mortem. It would be worth looking into. Is there any indication that this happens? Yes. If you look at the last two phalanges of Maria's hand, you can see that they're a little bit broader than you would expect them to be on the end of that finger. There does seem to be some reason for thinking that this is the last two knuckles of someone else's hand that have somehow been attached here. But again, we're not sure. Maybe this is something more complicated than that. It needs to be looked into. Why would the Nazca do this? Well, the Nazca are interested in skulls. They're interested in preserving body parts for various reasons. They took the heads of their enemies and they would put holes in them, and then they would run rope through it, and then they would carry it around as trophies. There's also evidence later on, like with the Inca, many hundreds of years later, that they used mummies as actual like members of the leadership of their community. So when a leader died, they would be mummified, and then they would continue to communicate to that leader through mediums who would care for the mummies, and these mummies would be carried around. Now, this is the Inca. The Nazca are much earlier than that, but you might suspect that there's some predecessor practice among the Nazca of using mummies in some way that's other than just burying them. They might be a part of community life in some way. Why would they make things look like this? Unclear why they would make things look like this, but there are marks all over the artwork here that they have some kind of value on being tridactyl. So there's a whole book about this by Jesus Cabrera that I would recommend taking a look at if you want to see some of these images. But you can see how all over these there are images of these tall, slender, elongated head, large-eyed tridactyl beings that show up in their artwork. So why would you make such a thing? Artistic wise, why would you make a JType? One thing that's interesting about this is we can read a lot off of the structure of the JType. I will just call them the artists, the body preparers, whatever they are. The artists put a huge amount of work and intention into creating these things. What did they want you to think of when you see these things? They want you to think tridactyl hands and feet. Obviously, they're building them for the JTypes and they're modifying M-types to do that. They want you to think elongated skull with two large eyes. They've shaped the llama skull in such a way that those, that rough part in the back, which is one of the tells that there has been cutting. Why do they leave that there? So that it's long enough to create the shape that they want. They create these two large eyes. There are no external ears. There is a flat nose. There is reptilian skin, very intentionally reptilian skin. They have added reptile skin to these bodies to say reptilian. The M types are very similar. Oh, sorry. There's also this slender body type, which you can also see in the artwork. The M types are very similar. They do not have reptilian skin on them, but they are hairless. People have talked about how their appearance is sort of reptilian. And they don't seem to have done any modifications to make the bodies look slenderer. But the same basic idea here seems to be in play. Now, I don't want to say that all they care about is tridactyls with large eyes and no external ears and reptilian skin, because there are other kinds of art around. And I want to call your attention to this image in particular. And even though we don't have time today to talk about the S types, we should at least just mention that this thing looks exactly like Suye, which, by the way, is probably a parrot. And the skull piece is a piece of llama jaw that's been carved. You can tell that weird shape inside the jaw of hyperdense things is probably the bottom of the remainders of the llama teeth. Summarize here. Why think archaeological objects as opposed to modern hoaxes? I'll do a pros and cons list here to wrap things up. So here's the pros of the archaeological hypothesis. It fits the radiocarbon dating and DNA. Those things are all reading old. The DNA is confusing, but it's broken up like old DNA is. They would be using period-appropriate methods, as talked about before. It resonates with known cultural elements. You'd have essentially as much time as you need because you don't have to get them all done between 2017 and now. You could do this over the course of hundreds of years, figure out how to make such a thing. Why would you do it? Because to create something that looked like a mummy, you would want to use body parts. If it is a mummy, that is, especially if it is in fact mostly human child, then it would just be a mummy. And then, you would be turning these things into this as some mechanism for communicating to the future, whatever you're trying to communicate about these strangely shaped bodies. You don't have to work with fragile mummies because you can work with fresh bodies. You don't have to use modern human remains. That's good. And one of the things I like about this theory is there are no bad actors. No one's trying to deceive anybody on this. It all just turned out the way it did because they were using the materials they had at their disposal. Why is anybody even thinking about a modern hoax hypothesis? Basically, only one reason, because it's weird that they look like our modern concept of an alien. I'm just going to kind of reiterate that over here. The pro of the modern hoax hypothesis is it explains why it looks like an alien. It looks like an alien because people with modern concepts of aliens made them. But there's all these cons. It doesn't fit the radiocarbon. There's the pipeline problem. So I want to draw I know I only have like a couple minutes left here, but like the M types would require substantial mutilation of several valuable, well-preserved human mummies with elongated skulls. If you took a mummy like Montserrat and decided to cut up her face and hands, you'd be doing something pretty stupid because she would already be an extremely valuable mummy that you could get money for in other contexts. J-types would require illegally hunting monkeys in the modern world or obtaining and altering recently deceased human babies. Of course, that would be extremely difficult. You would also need lots of llamas, but that's not as big a deal. There's the thing I'm going to call the forethought problem, which it would just take so much planning to think about all of these contingencies about what if you stuck people in a CT scan or a body in the CT scan? How could you make it so it looks like it's real and not fake? And my friend Elena was saying not even the CIA can do that much planning. So it's a little surprising to propose that here. There's also what I call the art direction problem. This is just such a fascinating and weird thing to do. Like, how would someone even come up with this idea other than through the necessity creating creativity thing? Could all of this be evidence of NHI alien contact? Yeah, it could be. Is it proof? No. If it's truly ancient, though, this does undermine the cultural pollution explanation. So people ask, when people say they have NHI encounters, why do they all say they look the same way? Suggestion, it's because once upon a time, there was this movie Close Encounters, which is based on other things that we know about, people saying things. That's why E.T. looks the way E.T. does. That's why the Nazca Mummies look the way they do. There's this cultural pollution, right? The reason that whoever these hoaxers are made these things is because they wanted them to look like aliens. There could be other explanations besides aliens. People have suggested that there are kind of psychological archetypes involved in experiencer things. Like the reason we see the grays is because there's something in our psychology that kind of creates this image over and over again. But that being said, if you're willing to consider alien contact as a possible explanation, which you should be, then there's a bunch of weird stuff in the air. The Nazca lines can only be seen from the sky. The Tapaka giant in Chile can only be seen from the sky. The smaller giant with a sword also in Chile can only be seen from the sky. There were beings that look like this on petroglyphs in Utah. There are statues that look like this in Japan. And look, at the end of the day, it might just be more sensible to say that all of these beings are explained by something else, some kind of encounter with something strange looking, tall, reptilian, big eyes, long skull, tridactyl hands. And there's a common explanation for all of these things. We're not saying it's aliens, but we're not saying it's not aliens. Okay, so next steps, and then I'll shut up. We need to engage indigenous people so that we can get down there and talk about studying human artifacts well. We need to do more DNA analysis. We need to do more proteomics analysis. We need to do stable isotope analysis, which can help us understand the environment of these things before they passed. We can do high resolution surface scanning to check to make sure that the skin skin hypothesis is correct, or disprove that if it's not correct. We need to compare M-type skulls to bound skulls from the Paracas and people like that. And we need to do as much of that as possible within Peru, because moving these things across international borders is hard to do, but also because the people of Peru deserve to have these things studied, and they deserve to participate in that as much as possible. I'm done. 4 o'clock. Boom. If I had time for questions, I would take them. Talk to me, Toby. What should we do?
Okay, I'm unmuted. I text you one question.
Let me pull it up. Has the analysis of glue plugs and adhesives using the bone been conducted to possibly link and identify organic molecules currently known as natural medical adhesives used in the ancient world? So the answer to this is no. The only thing I'm going off of right now is the absence of polymers. Now, that being said, this is very much a work in progress. So over time, we might be able to get better at figuring out exactly what the stuff is. But polymers show up in the analysis really, really quickly. So could it be some kind of a modern version of a hide glue? Like, you can make hide glue now. You can go take a hide and boil it. You can just buy hide glue on Amazon. So like, it could be modern hide glue. But again, so the point of that last kind of pros and cons list is there's really only one reason to think that these are modern hoaxes, which is that they look like aliens. That's the only reason. They radiocarbon date old, they DNA test old, and they're only made using old kinds of available techniques.